Hello and welcome back to the long-awaited review of the first Gorillaz album from 20 years ago in 2001. That doesn't feel right. Anyway, this is the major change in Damon Albarn's career. I used to say this was him going American. I don't really agree with that anymore. I said that back when I had a weaker understanding of what the British music scene was like at the turn of the millennium. I don't say that anymore. Now what I say is that this is him going multicultural, albeit in a kind of a transatlantic sense. It is an album of collaboration between Albarn and American hip-hop producers, specifically Dan the Automator and Kid Koala. Albarn had previously guested on the Deltron 3030 album the previous year, which is an album I highly recommend. One of the great underground hip-hop albums of the early 2000s. And this album very much has that Dan the Automator sound. There's Damon Albarn here, but Dan the Automator is very much in effect. And that's something I like about the first two Gorillaz albums, is that the producers are as much a part of the sound as Albarn. You know, Danger Mouse on Demon Days is doing the Danger Mouse thing, and it really works, and it's very unique, and it's very different from what Gorillaz kind of become from Plastic Beach onward, which is, you know, Damon Albarn's production sensibility. You're going to get samey synth effects and the megaphone filter, and you're going to get star-studded collabs all over the place, and it means that every Gorillaz album is kind of the same now, which I don't dislike. I'm a fan of pretty much every Gorillaz album, even the ones people don't like. But it means that when it actually comes down to listening to Gorillaz, I mostly reach for the first three albums. Anyway, I feel like most of you watching this review have probably heard this album, but some of you maybe haven't, I don't know. So the way I would describe this album's sound is later 90s Blur meets Deltron 3030, The Handsome Boy Modeling School, the first album, with hints of stuff like the Beta Band, Beck, maybe even a little bit of Beth Orton sort of sprinkled into the mix. As I said, it is very much the prototype for the rest of Damon Albarn's career. It's experimental by mainstream standards and very all over the place. A lot of stuff happens on this album, and, you know, I'm excited to talk about all of it after I talk a little bit about the characters, because after all, Gorillaz is a virtual band. Cartoonist Jamie Hewlett, best known for Tank Girl, is the only other permanent member of the project. Allegedly, the idea for the group came from watching MTV together and marveling at how fake and manufactured everything is, which seems like a very trite and, from Albarn's perspective, kind of hypocritical stance, considering, you know, the whole Blur thing. I've also, and this I had no idea, I've heard it alleged that they might have sort of ripped off the idea from this aborted project called Monkey Tennis that Jamie Hewlett worked on in, I think, like 97 or 96. It never went anywhere. Allegedly, there was a lawsuit over it during this era of Gorillaz that has been alluded to a few times over the years. But the concept art is out there. I wouldn't say it's one-to-one, because it's not at all. But I would say it's an intriguing thought that I was not aware of at the time I did my first review. I've also heard that the idea of a virtual band might have been something that Jamie Hewlett had floating around for a while, but that he just never found the right collaborator to make it work until he met Damon Albarn. But whatever the case, this is a very interesting album. It's a very important album in some respects for a lot of people. To me, maybe not as much as Demon Days. Demon Days is the album that I really point to, and I can do the whole, like, this album changed my life, this album changed my musical perceptions, I was never the same man after I listened to this album. Demon Days is the one I can do that for. But this is still an absolutely fantastic album, and I am very excited to talk about it with you today. So the album opens up with a track that kind of sounds like if Dan the Automator did some production work for the Beta Band with Damon Albarn on guest vocals. It's a great intro for the album, and it sets the vibe for the rest of the album really well. Slightly hip-hop, slightly rock, slightly electronic, and slightly stone. Another great track. Apparently at one point this was going to get a music video, but that kind of got scrapped. People have mocked up the music video with which I think is really cool. But yeah, it's a very interesting track with a chorus that has, ever since I first heard this album, I've never known what to make of that chorus. Yeah, it's a catchy track. If this sounds like Blur with hip-hop beats, that's because that's pretty much what this is. This was a track that the band worked up during the sessions for their 1999 album 13, but ultimately didn't wind up using. And I have to say, it's one of my favorite Gorillaz tracks. It really captures the vibe of the album. This is one of the last sort of malaise at the turn of the millennium albums. You know, that vibe that a lot of stuff from the late 90s and the pre-9/11 2000s has of, like, you know, it's a new century. What am I supposed to do? I'm just hanging around. My life's not going anywhere. What am I supposed to do? It's a new century. And then 9/11 happened and all of it went crazy. So, this track is the first piece of really kind of weird stuff on the album. It's slightly stone sounding folk with some cool trip hop beats. It reminds me a lot of something like Country Sad Ballad Man on Blur's self-titled album, which I just reviewed, go watch the video, but much more hip hop inflected. Somebody I knew once referred to this as like stoner film noir music, and I wish I could remember who it was so I could credit them. But that's an amazing description, and whoever you were spot on. This is the big track. Put Gorillaz on the map in America, enabled the guest rapper, Del the Funky Homo Sapien, to buy a house from the royalties from this track. You know, it's a phenomenal track. Richly deserved to be a hit. I'm a huge fan of Del the Funky Homo Sapien, and he really delivers perfectly on here. But the craziest thing about this track is that it almost didn't happen. Apparently Damon Albarn wanted some UK rappers called Phi Life Cypher to be on this album, but Dan the Automator wasn't feeling it, which I have to say was the right call, because we eventually got the Phi Life Cypher version of Clint Eastwood on G-Sides in 2002, and it actually kind of sucks, you know? I don't want to diss Phi Life Cypher, you know? The other outtake from this album that they're on, I think it's The Sounder, is great. They do a good job on here, but in fact, honestly, I've never heard a version of this song without Del that sounds any good at all, which is unfortunate. I like this track too. It's very trip-hop, weird, stone sounding, and a lot of other good things, but to be perfectly honest with you, my main takeaway from this track has always been that opening line. This is a breakfast club! Which is just so bizarre that it's, when I think about this song, I only hear that line. Punk is a great little old school punk track, as the name would indicate. It reminds me a lot of Chinese Bombs, again on Blur's self-titled. It's weird because 13 was the most recent Blur album at this point, and Bugman, I believe the second track on 13, is the most Gorillaz thing Blur have ever done. For some reason, this album, if it reminds me of any Blur album, it's definitely the self-titled, and I have no idea why. This is another track where it threw me off for a while because the opening is kind of annoying and honestly not that good. But when you get into the dub section of this song, it's amazing. I don't know why, but just about every time Damon Albarn messes with dub, it's consistently one of my favorite tracks he's ever done. And the actual main body of this track very much falls into that. It has that great, depressed, early 2000s malaise vibe from Tomorrow Comes Today. And I love the record scratches, you know, it's a great touch on a great track. Double bass is a great instrumental. It's one of my favorite of the weird sort of middle tracks on this album, and it's one I always look forward to when I'm listening to the album. There's not a whole lot else to say, it's just a cool little bass jam. Rock the House is the other Del the Funky Homo Sapien cut on this album. I actually don't know whether this was recorded before or after Clint Eastwood. Maybe I should have done my research a little more carefully. But it feels very much like it's trying to recapture that magic. And for me at least, it doesn't quite get there, but it comes close enough. I've heard other people say this is the one track on the album they would cut if they had the choice. But for me, I love Del. I'm just happy to hear him on this album, you know? I'm just happy to hear more of him. But yeah, uses a great old, I think 70s sample, some great keyboard bits. It's a fun track. I won't lie, it is a little bit phoned in by the standards of the rest of the tracks on this album, but on the whole, I like it. 19-2000 is another fantastic track, although I will be the first to admit that those female vocals can get just a little bit grating at times. Which, I mean, Damon Albarn can too, so, you know, it's a mixed bag. I actually had no idea for the longest time that Tina Weymouth and Chris Frantz of the Talking Heads were both on this album. Tina Weymouth is doing some backing vocals here, which is really interesting, which I actually had never heard of until last year. When I said this album was pretty diverse, I meant it. This is basically a Latin trip-hop track featuring, and I am probably going to butcher this gentleman's name, I am very, very sorry, Ibrahim Ferrer of the Buena Vista Social Club. And it's another phenomenal track, very distinct, one of the most interesting things on this album. Much like Clint Eastwood though, it's another track. Almost wasn't even what we know. It almost wasn't even Latin Simone. Because there's a Damon Albarn version of this track where it's basically just a Gorillaz solo cut. And I have to say, it's good, but it's a lot weaker than this version. Really adds a lot of character and charisma to this track that just sort of isn't there on the outtake. It's just sort of another Damon Albarn Gorillaz track. This track is another favorite of mine, although it's one that I always forget about when I'm not listening to the album. I love this weird, folksy, almost kind of dub thing happening here. And Damon Albarn's vocal performance threads that fine line between being annoying and sounding cool. This is another track I always kind of forget about. Or at least I forget that it's as long as it is. I always remember bits of it, but I don't ever remember the entire song. It's a sparse, kind of keyboard-centric thing. It's good, I like it. M1A1 is a phenomenal album closer. It's another track, kind of like New Genius or Gravity, that starts off kind of annoying. That, I think it's a Dawn of the Dead sample, goes on for like a minute and a half, and it gets boring. But fortunately, once the actual song kicks in, it's a great, upbeat, high-octane ride to the very end of the album. So something I failed to mention the first time I reviewed this album is that this is one of those albums that has bonus tracks that were part of the album on release, which is weird and I don't particularly like. I mean, just put it in your album. Like, why not have it be a part of the album? I don't get it. These bonus tracks have fluctuated quite a bit over the years. Some of them are really good, some of them not so much. Apparently the original UK album just had 2 remixes of Clint Eastwood and the aforementioned Soul Child remix of 19-2000. I'm gonna blow through those very quickly. The Ed Case Refix version of Clint Eastwood kinda sucks to me. Like I said, it's really weird. I've never heard a version of Clint Eastwood that I liked aside from the original version that was released on this album. I don't like it when they use other rappers live. I don't like any of the remixes I've heard. I don't like the original Phi Life Cypher version. It's a weird track that doesn't really work for me in any version other than the one on the album. Now the Soul Child remix is a different story. The Soul Child remix, I won't quite say that I like it better than the album version of 19-2000, but I do understand why someone would like it more. It speeds up the track, it gets rid of most of the annoying parts of 19-2000, and just leaves you with this incredibly saccharine, sugary pop song. Now, apparently the American version of this album, and there's some confusion here because apparently in the beginning the American version was just Dracula and Left Hand Suzuki Method, and then at some point the version that I have, which I bought in the 2010s, has Dracula, Left Hand Suzuki Method, and Soul Child remix and the Ed Case refix. So it's interesting. Dracula is a great, very stoned, dubby thing with great horror movie sample bit-ish things. I don't know if they actually are horror samples. I know that was originally going to be a much bigger part of Gorillaz than it ultimately wound up being. Left Hand Suzuki Method, on the other hand, is very hip-hop. It's probably the most hip-hop thing I've heard from these sessions, other than the ones that have rappers on them. It's very Dan the Automator, but it's also very sort of proto-Monkey and a little bit some of the stuff that was going to be on Demon Days. It's one of the more forward-looking things on this album, but I can understand why it was cut. Originally wasn't on this album. I think it was originally released on G-Sides, which is pretty much just an outtakes collection. Like I said, you get the original version of Latin Simone, you get the original version of Clint Eastwood, and you get a couple of interesting reject tracks like The Sounder, Faust, Ghost Train, and Hip Albatross that are definitely worth your time, but not necessarily stuff that you absolutely have to hear, but definitely give it a listen if you haven't. Anyway, finally, the album on the whole. Needless to say, this is an album I like very much. It's an interesting album that does a lot of things that I really like, and 1 or 2 things that I don't like. It is a very long listen, and that length is sort of exacerbated by the diversity of the material. You know, if an album's all the same thing, it's usually, to me at least, it doesn't feel quite as long, but when there's a lot of different stuff going on across like 16 or 17 tracks, you notice it much more. A lot of the tracks, I won't say they try your patience, but at least for me, there are a number of tracks that are kind of slow going, hard to get into at first. They have kind of irritating intros and outros, and it's only the meat in the middle that's actually good. But on the whole, it's a very, very solid album. It's, as I said, many, many respects the blueprint of where Damon Albarn was going to go. And it's one of those more than the sum of its parts albums, because you take it track by track, it maybe doesn't hold up quite as well as if you just barrel through the entire album. I also think it's, even though this is like throbbing heart of the CD era, vinyl was deader than dead at this point in time. I think it's maybe an album that benefits from vinyl, not in the like, it's not compressed. You hear the space in the music, the analog format. It's a superior sound about an album that was recorded and mastered digitally. but in the sense that with vinyl, you know, you're listening in, I would say with this, like 15 to 17 minute intervals, you know, with a short break in the middle to turn the side over. And for some reason, with a lot of, and this is a personal thing, it may be different for you, you may be totally down with like an hour plus albums. This might be a personal hang-up of mine. For some reason, with very long albums, vinyl for me works better because you get that little break. And sometimes that's all you need is like a minute or less to get up and turn the disc over. I don't know why. I can't explain that. But anyway, it is a very, very good album. To me, it's not the best Gorillaz album. That Demon Days is my favorite by a long shot. And I think you could, I wouldn't, but you could, if you were so inclined, make the argument that Plastic Beach is a more even listen than this. But I don't know. There's some stuff on Plastic Beach that makes that album kind of a slog to get through at times. But yeah. So I would rate this an easy 9 out of 10, maybe a 9.5 depending on the day, but an easy 9.5, 9 out of 10. A very, very good album. I'm sort of torn as to whether it's a good entry point into the band, but you know what? It was good enough for people in 2001. It was good enough for me when I got into these guys, which was a while ago now, but not in 2001. It's good enough for you. Listen to this album today. I'm so sorry about this review. I will see you all later.